Good afternoon, and welcome to Unapologetic Educational Research, addressing anti-Blackness, racism, and white supremacy. Thank you for spending time with us today. This series is a collaborative effort sponsored by the Department of Educational Studies and the Qual Lab, both entities in the College of Education and Human Ecology at The Ohio State University. My name is Lori Patton Davis, and I have the pleasure of serving as chair for the Department of Educational Studies and professor of higher education and student affairs. I'm honored to serve as one of the series co-hosts. The purpose of the series is to engage our alums and general audiences in thinking about and reflecting on what it means to conduct educational research from a standpoint that honors Black lives in the research process, while also disrupting racism and white supremacy. Given this critical and turbulent time, we are committed to pushing the landscape of qualitative research and using it to shift our sociopolitical context toward racial equity and justice. Each speaker within the series is a nationally recognized educational researcher and scholar. Perhaps most special is that each speaker is an alum of our college. We hope you find this series beneficial and educational. We encourage you to take notes, reflect, and consider your standpoint and role in the development and implementation of unapologetic educational research. I now will turn things over to my colleague and thought partner, Dr. Penny Pasquay.
Thank you, Lori. Let me also share my welcome. We are so glad that you are joining us here today and taking time out of your schedule to give some of this important work your thought. My name is Penny Pasquay, and my chosen pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm a professor in educational studies. I'm also the director of the college's new Qual Lab, which we launched this summer, where we focus on advancing qualitative inquiry toward equity, diversity, and justice, as well as increasing the capacity of qualitative research within our college and beyond. I'm also an editor of the Review of Higher Education. Let me quickly share the outline, which will be posted in a second. We've already shared the housekeeping slide, but we'll put it in the Q&A for late arrivals. I should also take a second to thank everyone behind the scenes who helped to make this event happen. This includes our doctoral student, Jasmine Marks, our closed captioning team member, the Office of Advancement, the Dean's Office, and the Dean. In a minute, our Dean will introduce the guest speaker. After that, Dr. Mark Gooden will share his important research on examining the racialization of positionality in research endeavors. Then we'll engage in a dialogue between Dr. Mark Gooden, Dr. Lori Patton Davis, and me. Questions from the Q&A will be coordinated by Jasmine Marks, so please feel free to use this throughout the session, and that way she'll monitor and then provide us with questions that you've shared now or as you registered. We also have those questions as well. Finally, we'll take time to wrap up. And now I have the pleasure of introducing you all to the Dean of our College of Education and Human Ecology at The Ohio State University, Dean Don Pope Davis.
Thank you, Penny. Thank you for the introduction. Lori, thank you also for you both doing and engaging in this important work. I am delighted to introduce Dr. Mark Anthony Gooden to you today. Dr. Gooden is the Christian A. Johnson Endeavor Professor in Education Leadership, as well as the director of the Endeavor Anti-Racist and Restorative Leadership Initiative in the Department of Organizational and Leadership within Teachers College at Columbia University. Prior to his time at Columbia, he was a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and before that, a professor at the University of Cincinnati. Dr. Gooden earned both his doctorate and master's degree in education, policy, and leadership here in the College of Education and Human Ecology at The Ohio State University. He received his bachelor's degree at Albany State College, an HBCU located in Albany, Georgia. He focuses his scholarship on equity-centered, anti-racist, and culturally responsive school leadership, as well as legal issues related to education. Dr. Gooden is a prolific author on these topics, publishing in leading peer journals such as the AERA Educational Administration Quarterly, Teachers College Record, to name a few. He also currently serves as the associate editor for Urban Education and is an editorial board member of the Journal of Research on Leadership Education. In addition, he has authored many books as well as book chapters and published extensively in the field. All of this work is informed by Dr. Gooden's early career as a mathematics teacher right here in Columbus, in the Columbus City School Districts, first at Southmore Middle School and then at Independence High School. While in the district, he impacted countless number of students and colleagues before joining us here at EHE as a graduate student, where he continued to do the same as a doctoral student. Dr. Gooden, welcome back to the Ohio State University and the College of Education and Human Ecology. We are pleased to have you join us here today. Thank you.
All right, Dean Don Pope Davis, thank you so much for that great introduction. So we're gonna get there to slides. Thank you so much. Well, I'm anxious to get started. I just want to do my proper, so to speak. Let me just say, just thank you for the invitation. I also want to say just thank you to the Ohio State University for really just giving me the opportunity to develop into the scholar and leader that I am. I'm so appreciative to a number of folks, and I'd just be remiss if I did not acknowledge some of those folks. So please bear with me as I just really just think of a few folks I'm very excited about today. But I do want to just first and foremost thank just Cynthia Dillard and Dr. Bob Ransom for their work in bringing together the prof scholars who really, I mean, I think they really poured so much into us to have a vision to increase the number of scholars of color in the professoriate. So I just want to thank them for that work. My advisor, TK Daniel, and also just a number of Black scholars we interacted and engaged with while there, including people like Cynthia Tyson, Tyrone Howard, just when you start naming names, Bev Gordon, just a number of folks who were there to really support us in our learning and development. And so I'm just really eternally grateful to them. And also Patty Brosnan, who is in mathematics education, who was instrumental in introducing me to Ohio State's in my first master's program. And thank you to just my my fellow, I always say they're our fellow cohort members, although some of us were in policy and leadership and others were in other places. But first and foremost, my brother, Rich Milner, my brother from another, who's always been supportive over the last 20 years of being a professor and having really great conversations. And folks who've stayed in touch, like Joy Gaston Gales, we remain friends and stayed connected. The person I call my little sister in the academy, April Peters Hawkins, who has already done a talk, and of course, the brilliant D.L. Stewart. So those folks and a number of others, I can just go down the list, have really been instrumental in my personal growth and just watching their work and keeping me encouraged along the way. So as I said, I'm very excited. I want to go ahead and get started. I think my time starts after I do introductions, at least I hope it does. But I'm going to do my best to stay within the 15 minutes because I really am looking forward to having a conversation, with you on this. Making sure it's my video, start my video. Okay, make sure that's happening on the video there. All right, I'm just going to jump right into it. So on the topic today of positionality, I wanted to be a little more creative in how I'm thinking about some new ideas. So I'm interested in the conversation and having a discussion about what that looks like as we engage on the work. So positionality for me is a critical understanding of how the role of a scholar's personal identity and present position, be that as a graduate student, an assistant professor, associate professor, whatever you are in the academy, how those two pieces come together, whether they are socially constructed and or internally defined, to factor into the research process, commonly recognized in qualitative research in the social sciences. Positionality considers a variety of epistemologies, that is, ways of knowing or understanding of the world. It calls into question the dominant notions of objectivity in the academy, thus providing resistance to post-positivist constructions of knowledge. Positionality can provide opportunities for the researcher to critically interrogate beliefs, assumptions, motivations, and decisions at multiple stages of the research process. Positionality can assist a scholar in reflecting upon how the topic to investigate was selected and even the ways the research design was created. And I like to think of about positionality as also having an impact on quantitative research as well, certainly in different ways, but I believe it should play a more prominent role, even though that accepted, dispassionate, often racially neutral type of objectivity renders it invisible. So there's an interesting quote that I like that says, there can, of course, be no apolitical scholarship. So regardless of how we engage in our process of scholarship, I believe that applies. Next slide, please. So here is a diagram that I want to just talk a little bit about from an article by Jacobson and Mustafa. And these are fairly new researchers, and what they wanted to do in this process was offer some support about how to engage in positionality in a way that's visual and engaging for people. So they really go through this process of separating this into three pieces. If you look at the red boxes, those are what they call, well, what we recognize as social identities. So they said people should really be open to exploring their social identities. For example, class, race, citizenship, ability, sexual orientation, so on and so forth. The second box, the gray box that moves from the red box, is how these positions impact our life. And they call this the tier 2. And this is where you really start to think a little bit more about your social identity, but then you don't stop there. You think about the important details of how that social identity plays out. So these three pieces, I'm going to give you an example in a couple of slides, but I wanted folks to just think about a visual representation of how folks can start to think about positionality. Obviously, there's the complexity of intersectionality in qualitative research. There's the intersectionality as we think about and engage in research, but I thought it was a great way to get people to just start to think about our social identities and how they not only impact our life, but thereby interact our research endeavors as well. Next slide, please. So for me, personal identity really aligns with what Jacobson and Mustafa have put together in this identity map. Racially, I identify as Black, heterosexual, cisgender, Christian, and able-bodied male. And those present for me ways of being inside and outside in the process of doing research. Culturally, I identify as African-American, which also represents ethnicity for me. And that brings together some cultural markers for me, spirituality being one, intellectual engagement, collective and connectiveness, ways of coming together with groups of people to share oral traditions, humor to get by, and engagement around food, and also understanding that you have to be twice as good, at least is what I've been told from since I was a child, to survive in this world. You have to be twice as good as your white counterpart. And survival, I've understood, is a form of resistance. But there's protest music, and there's also reading, storytelling, oratorical, and spoken word. All of those to me represent aspects of that oral tradition, which has been really important to pass along stories in a number of African perspectives. So I went to school in Albany, Georgia at integrated high school, but there's some stories there as well. And then I moved from there to a high school, from high school to Albany State, as you heard Dean Pope Davis say, which was a historically Black university, which had an enormous impact on my thinking of who I was and my identity development. From there, I went to Ohio State, moved to Columbus, Ohio, the Ohio State University. But the interesting thing about that is contrasting what the HBCU meant to me and what it poured into me, and then understanding how to navigate in a predominantly white institution was quite a bit to take, and it took a lot of learning, and you'll hear a little bit more about that in a moment. And then for me, nationality, I identify as American. And coming from the South, primacy of US citizenship is very important. We all know and have reviewed the 14th Amendment and understand that in the South, there was an outright denial of citizenship rights for Black people, including voting rights, right? And so the 14th Amendment plays really large, not only in my thinking, but it had a lot to do with how I engaged around research, and it held my interest, for quite a while, and it still continues to do so today. So as you heard, I started out as a teacher, but I had a number of questions about race and culture and how they not only impacted my life, but how they impacted my teaching. And those same questions I brought into the PhD program with me, still being an explorer in this work. Next slide, please. So as I promised, this is an example of the first author, Jacobson, in this piece I just mentioned, where she actually writes out these 3 tiers around her social identity. And you can see she identifies as white. And then this tier 2, she talks about within the article as well, how that presents her with institutional ease and privilege. And then she expands the details of that around institutional ease in engaging with the police. And then there's a lack of hassle for her. That's very different from me. If I were filling this out for me as Black, and it wouldn't be institutional ease. It would be written as institutional navigation. There are some points though that there is institutional ease. And so I have to admit, and then what does it mean to be privileged in the academy and then not have privilege, within the academy, and privilege in the broader society? So if you work your way across these different types of identities, and I'm not going to read all of them to you, but I wanted you to just get an understanding of how people could really engage visually with their social identities and then start to think about what that means to me when I engage in the different levels of the research process. Next slide, please. So if you keep those in mind, I wanted to just go in and talk about an example of a paper I did published in 2014. And since it was published in 2014, some of these references are a bit dated, but I thought they were actually still relevant. So I used autoethnography in this study to guide a self-analysis of my professional and social identity as a successful African-American professor. Autoethnography is appropriate as it displays multiple levels of consciousness, connecting the personal to the cultural, and you'll start to see some of these connected themes. My journey in becoming miseducated involved a mostly linear, but sometimes cyclical progression through the 5 developmental stages of Nigrescence. And so this is Bill Cross's model around Black identity development. And what I do is I look at that model and then think through what an autoethnography, what I sometimes call like a racial autobiography, meant for me as I thought about how race impacted my life. So you can see the connections between the Jacobson and the Mustafa piece. So there's a distinction between the marginality imposed by oppressive structures and the marginality one chooses as a site of resistance for radical openness and possibility. And this is from Bell Hooks, of course. And what I like about this quote is it really situates for me my thinking of being in the academy is a challenge. But I think once we have understood something about being in the academy, and 20 years in, I think I know maybe 1 or 2 things. I'm still learning, of course. We have the option to really look at radical openness and possibility. How can we resist what the academy is and then change it into something that works better for people who look like me? So ultimately, at the end of the article, I conclude that there is value in continuing to interrogate my racial identity in the academy, and that it is also important to assert aspects of my social identity as a way to resist and survive, and dare I say, also thrive. Next slide, please. Okay, so some insight from the article. Like Ellison's narrator, I now know that I am invisible and hypervisible. As a Black man, I can feel categorized, compartmentalized, invisibilized, and confined in the knowledge creation process. My experiences often are taken for granted, and there's an attempt to norm those experiences. And if to the extent I go along with those, there's less resistance. But if I go against them, they can be questioned if they sound too divergent from white expectations of the academy. And the academy does have expectations of me to have gone through the levels. And in Q&A, I can talk a little bit more about what that means. Or those differences from what white colleagues think as well. I'm not expected to disrupt the academy's flow or question its legitimacy. Constantly, I am urged to blend into the structure and the culture and to integrate with limited complaining so that it comforts others, or at least doesn't make them feel, discomfort. So there's always this idea, this cryptic word about fit. It's like just fit in the changing way that's being defined today. And I think that's a moving target, this whole thing about fit. So as Black folks, we're expected to fit within the supposedly colorblind PWI and make little of race, especially as academic institutions join a host of other woke organizations. Cultural taxation calls on Black males to be scholars and Black folks, period, and to do race-based service work, such as participate on diversity committees, and a number of other things like offer particular perspectives, be that Black person on the grant, or be that Black person that shows up to really support students who we brought in, but we have not prepared to really support in a broader way. If I happen to succeed, it's implied that I should apologize for being good or being street smart. Next slide, please. So I think all of that goes toward the academy having this notion of racialization. And as I said, I'm applying John Powell's definition here to the academy. So I've taken some liberties to redefine it for my purpose here. I define racialization as a set of beliefs, mental constructions, practices, and cultural norms that support current institutional arrangements that both reflect and help to create knowledge by maintaining race-based exclusions in research. So we can also say conclusions, but definitely it's race-based exclusions in research. So while positionality can affirm Black scholars' curiosity of what to investigate, racialization maintains the normality of the academy through a distinctive promotion of anti-Blackness. So when you think about a racial hierarchy coupled with this system of racialization, it in turn both together, regulate Black research endeavors to the bottom and invites other scholars to dismiss the legitimacy of this research or even build from it or claim it. And one of the questions that came ahead of time asked, did I think other folks could be, scholars of color could get caught up in this? At least that's my reinterpretation of the question. And in a racial hierarchy where there's anti-Blackness, the answer to that is yes. A lot of us, as I said earlier, we reproduce some of these ways of being in the academy. We take them to be normed as neutral or the way it is without pushing back against them. So on one hand, positionality can raise racial and cultural awareness for white researchers. On the other hand, racialization privileges dominant researchers and affirms the current state of affairs. Racialization attempts to exclude, constrain, or control knowledge creation for and about Black people. Black researchers frequently navigate by having to sidestep or minimize the meaning of doing research in a white-dominated world that still seeks to surveil deeper explorations of race or monitor those in a way that's comfortable or in a way that is done within a certain amount of time. So in this sense, racialization as a system is normalized. So I'm going to stop there, and I think that is enough to open up the conversation. So I'm inviting, I think, Dr. Pasquay and Dr. Patton Davis to come back and join me, and we're going to see if I can pass my dissertation again here at The Ohio State University.
That was so great. Thank you so much. I am just inspired. I have a ton of questions, but I know I really am more excited about engaging in a dialogue with you and with Lori. So maybe we'll start with the same question that we've asked every presenter in the series. I'm just inspired by your work on researcher positionality, as well as that you were able to start by naming your own identities. Not every scholar who talks about positionalities actually takes that risk and does that in an academic space. So thank you for that. And so as you think about this, what does anti-Blackness, racism, and white supremacy in educational research mean to you? And how do you address these complexities in your own research?
Yes, wow, yeah. So very good question. Thank you for that, Dr. Pasquay. So, so for me, all of these pieces come together within this system we have in America. I'm a big fan of legal research and legal history and how we have a system that's been constructed around. I just go back to this racial hierarchy, right? And we don't put the names and the terms to it. Behind me, I have Isabel Wilkerson's caste system. I love the way she beautifully writes about this idea of a caste system. And in my mind, that comes out as a racial hierarchy. And so I sometimes in my presentations, I use this really outdated, I say outdated, right? Pyramid that I got off the web that has literally at the bottom, like Black folks as chattel. And then it has at the top, white people as property owners. And then it has in the middle, like some really rough descriptions of other people of color. And so it's a crude illustration, but it has application today, right? We'll say, oh, nobody really believes in that, and blacks on the bottom. But you'll find that in a number of ways, we actually do have policies, we have practices that align with anti-Blackness. And so when we hear things, when we do the work we do, there's always a Blackness on the bottom kind of construction. Even when people come to this country, and I've had some of my students tell me this, you know, they're told like, okay, you're going to be better than Black people. And sometimes these are people from different parts of Africa who, you know, who come in and say, well, we thought that Black folks were lazy, and, you know, all of these narratives about they're roguish and they're suspect. And so that sets up the thinking, but it's not just what they're told, it's what people see. It's what we see in terms of the media. So we constantly have a contrast in the anti-Blackness, this construction of whiteness as controlling the knowledge, controlling knowledge construction. We get a lot of scholars who say, you know, you're doing work on Black people. That's too narrow. You can't do a study about Black folks unless you get like some white people in there, because otherwise it's really not legitimate. I mean, who wants to learn about just Black people, right? So those kinds of constructions really set up not only anti-Blacknesses, but they reaffirm white supremacy, right? And they reaffirm all of these other thoughts around colonization and what it means to be in a suspect class. And so if we're thoughtful about it, we can come up in a run of a month or so, all of the ways in the academy that racial hierarchy is emphasized, but never really said, right? Mm-hmm. Stated, but never really challenged. And I'll just give another example, a real practical example, and I'll be careful about this because this is like with a person of color. But I once made the argument that the GRE test was problematic for Black people. And, you know, I went through the whole research, but people talk about it being correlated with the mother's education. And it really nobody really admitted it. It showed a lot about what the students would be able to do once they got to graduate school. Everybody was in agreement about that. And so I was sort of one bringing it up and saying it. And the counter argument was made, well, in order to compete with the top institutions in the country, we need to really have the GRE score. And I said, oh, okay, well, now this is before everybody started to kind of you got some institutions saying, okay, let's just get rid of it, right? This is before that. Now, here's the thing, what happens to me in terms of positionality and personal position within the academy. The person who is saying that to me is in a position of power to not invite me to like the next meeting. And, you know, we get busy. And I just realized that, man, am I still on that faculty? No, that's people like, I thought we had stopped meeting. But what happened in reality was I have been punished for really pushing against something that was anti-Black. And so within that racial hierarchy, this is okay. We can do this. And so if you're going to push against that, then, you know, we're just going to push you over to the side. You know, and so I think that's just one of those really one of those really specific examples of some of the crude things that happen within the academy if you start to push back against something and make those kinds of arguments. So I know that's a long question, but it also plays out in other ways around funding and administration. I've had the pleasure, and maybe I should say the blessing and the curse, to serve in some administrative roles to get an understanding of how institutions work. And I think everybody should get this opportunity. Just even if you're talking about a program chair or a program director, because it brings up another way in which the academy ties resources or lack of access to resources to the same hierarchy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I want to hop in here because I think it ties in closely to what you said. So one of the things I picked up as I listened was, you know, on one hand, there's, you know, positionality, but there's also the act of being positioned, or what you know, call racialization. And I think, as I listen, you've offered a lot of examples for, how this racialization happens, why it's so hard to, one, position yourselves in, a system that already has decided to name you in particular ways. But aside from naming the particular strategies for how Black people get positioned, what would you say are some of the ways, or what recommendations would you give for acts of resistance, right? So I think you listed one, and just, trying to be in these particular spaces and raising your voice. And of course, there are repercussions, but what are some other acts of resistance? And in particular, what are acts of resistance as scholars are engaging in qualitative research?
Oh, okay. Well, Dr. Patton Davis, first let me just say, great question, great set of questions. So let's start with acts of resistance. I will be very clear, and I've had the pleasure to mentor just a really wonderful group of scholars, up and coming scholars over the years, and many of them are doing, most of them are doing extremely well. And I think they've taught me some things. So mentoring, that's a kind of shaky word. Mentor them as they mentor me, as I like to say. But one of the things I say first and foremost, if you are a Black person in the academy, I put in there survivors of former resistance. If you have committed to getting your PhD and your EDD, and you're going in and you want to do this thing, you need to make sure that you're doing things to make sure that you're going to be there. You're going to, certainly work to support scholars who are up and coming, but you're also going to support yourself in the academy and understand what the rules are. You're going to get a mentor or a set of mentors, because we need you to be there. There are a number of spaces I've gone in, and there needs to be more Black scholars there. And so I remember the things from Dr. Dillard and Dr. Bob, just helping us understand, like, what does it take to survive in the academy and be present? And then we start talking about strategies. So what does that mean? So understand what those requirements are for Black scholars, and make sure, like one of my mentors told me, if they tell you 2 to 3, you're probably going to be aiming for that 2 to 3 plus maybe one more. You have to be careful around the service component. I find a lot of us are really committed to being supportive because we've come through spaces and places where people have been supportive of us, but you have to be smart about that. You just have to be serve on those high profile committees, and don't always slip into, you're the person of color and we love you and we want you to do that. You just almost have to be, I just use the word subversive. I used to, one strategy I say to scholars of color, and this was shared to me, I can't remember who presented it to me, set up those meeting times with yourself to do your writing and your research. All of that it may sound self-centered, or it may sound a little bit selfish, but if you were recruited there, you're offering something to that institution, and they need you more than they're going to admit. And I see so many scholars of color get tripped up by folks telling them, no, it's okay to have this, it's okay to have that. Know the kind of institution you're in, talk to people who are there, who can be solid mentors. If you have questions about that, talk to mentors outside of that. For instance, I had one scholar tell me one time, where she had done several book chapters. And I said, okay, well, you want to make sure that you do enough referee journal articles, because I hope that this remains a good spot for you. But the academy is tricky for Black folks. They may like you in year 1, and then year 2 and year 3, not so much. But you need to have a ticket out of there. And if they told you to just do book chapters, and you get to year 3 and it's time to go, your heart is broken, but at least you published in a sense that you can go somewhere. If you haven't published anything but book chapters, and I'm just saying the rules of the academy, that's going to make it hard for you to move. And I just want folks to be able to, in case things go sour, to move to another institution. I don't know if that's enough. I got more. I can keep talking, but I know there's a second part of that around qualitative research.
Keep going.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So one thing I should say, while at Ohio State, I was actually I went through a number of the quantitative series. I went to psychology, and I can tell you all stories about that one. I did the Ag Ed series, and then at that time, Policy and Leadership had a research series as well. So I'd done all of those, and one of the things that, I noticed, or as I have worked in teams with folks who are doing qualitative research, is, we get into these spaces where people, I would say, unfairly judge qualitative research. And I think I've been on committees where students come in and they unfairly judge their work, right? They describe it as if it's like it's secondary to folks who decide to take a quantitative approach. So that thing about generalizability. And so I started to talk about giving some pushback. And Dean Pope Davis, he may get mad at me, but I'm going to talk about like when psychologists do their work. You saw in my work, I'm a big fan of psychologists like Bill Cross and a number of others. And I love like that experimental approach. However, when I would teach my Intro to Systems of Human Inquiry class, there's some rules about generalization. And what we don't do is we don't criticize quantitative research when it doesn't adhere to some of those rules, right? So for example, when psychologists are doing their work, they say, all right, we're supposed to randomly sample from the population. But why do we do that? So that we can generalize back to the population, right? So but that's expensive. It takes money to do that. So what oftentimes happens, not always, but oftentimes we find that a lot of psychology researchers will randomly sample, or not random, just use some graduate students, right? They'll write the research and say, we'll get some graduate students in here, or we'll get folks, and it'll be a convenient sample. But if you read closely, and this is what my students, I would have them read, I would say, did they randomly select them? And they said, they didn't. And then they do, and then when they get to the end, they'd be like, well, wait a minute, what's the population? Who can they generalize to? And they said, well, to the students, right? But who do they generalize to? Oftentimes, editors will let this slip every time. They get to generalize out to the whole world, right? And we just look at it and say, that's good research, right? So I think I've seen a number of articles where that's been constructed. Once again, I'm not generalizing, to use that word again, all of them, but I think what doesn't happen is qualitative researchers coming in and saying, this research is contextual, just like quality. It's not bad. It's just understand what your context is and don't go beyond that. And so as I talk to qualitative researchers, when there's that aim of getting the richness of the context, getting an understanding of what, especially around race, that sometimes the larger studies, large scale studies just don't do as well. That's a richness that we need. Mm-hmm. Right? The pieces I talked about in terms of oral traditions, we've learned so much from that, because think about it, historically, Black folks, the narratives were not included, right? And when you were included in the research, it was not in a way that you wanted to be included, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a history that we have to bring up and examine and talk about. And I use, in training leaders, we talk about a number of these quantitatively normed assessments, but it's always like, well, what's the norm reference group? Which group was it? And some of these, a lot of the assessments on leaders, if they admit it, they're like, well, yeah, our group was like all white men. Mm-hmm. There's no other kind of leadership, but like all white men, and you're going to take this assessment, and it should pretty much it should work with everybody. Which is why I, along with my colleague Muhammad Khalif, and I talk like, no, there needs to be culturally responsive school leadership. There needs to be culturally responsive leadership, because you need to understand some things that have not been represented by your norm group.
That's right. That I so appreciate what you're saying. I mean, I think I think of it in a couple different ways. So, with generalizability, if you're picking off a group of all white people and then thinking that that's going to generalize to an entire population, that's not the case. I mean, that just is not the case. And so I think there's a call for over sampling, for example. I mean, paying attention to all Black people in studies, and also by Black researchers. As a white scholar, I think it's pretty dangerous for me to start thinking that I don't have the same role that is needed in that situation always. I think paying attention to positionality makes a difference here. I also think, I appreciate your point about generalizability is not necessarily always the goal either. So like with your autoethnographic piece, that is important and not necessarily generalizable. It's offered as qualitative research within context. And so to your point about survival is an act of resistance. And now you're taking it further by speaking up in academic spaces about policy, about research, what research should be done. How do you continue to operate or really ask scholars, early career scholars, graduate students to continue to interrupt those dominant paradigms that they know are not right and to continue to push on that? How much?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. You know, I always say we have to be realistic about vulnerability in the academy. I also balance that with there's some privilege to arrive in that space and get in there. But I always say to folks, what I'm sharing with you is not something I wholeheartedly endorse, but I'm really trying to share it with you in a way that you understand. You know, one of my mentors used to say it this way. He said, you know, there's no requirement to like that which has been understood, right? But there is a requirement to understand it. So I just want you to understand that this is how it works. I mean, let's look at the kind of institution you're going to. Let's look at where you're going. So if you have that understanding, I mean, you know how to defend yourself. You know how to protect yourself, and you can better navigate and move into that space. And wait, I feel like there was a second part of your question, Dr. Passway. It went out of my head.
No, that works. I mean, just advice for scholars, early career scholars, or
yes. Oh yeah. And one other point, the idea about protecting yourself. You know, I think that there's a mentoring piece. I think that there's the understanding of what's there. And I also think that taking care of yourself, your health. You know, we're seeing a number of younger folks carrying an enormous amount of stress. And this plays out, I believe, for Black scholars in particular ways. And Rich Miller and I talk about this, you know, from time to time. When you're in the academy, even though that's why this piece was, when you talked about this, right? It's not like it's an N of one, and so people are like, there's no way. But in terms of my own personal well-being and my understanding of why is it that at the time I wrote that I'm an associate professor, I go in and I can do my work, and I can't remember, I think I was a program director at the time, and I do all of these things that the academy tells I'm supposed to do. But at the end of the day, there's just some person who says that one thing, and I'm just like messed up the whole. I'm like, what the heck? What just happened? Because it's not that one thing. The one thing is I'm not going to use the word trigger, but it's that one thing, that straw that broke the camel's back. Because all day long you've been getting this other, well, probably longer than that. So are you really supposed to be here? Are you like, why are you? And so if you are really working through that, that's why certain things hit you. You say, well, I thought I had been promoted. I thought I was making it, but you sort of have to step back and reevaluate. And so it's been helpful for me to talk to folks like mentors, like Linda Tillman, just helping me understand, another Ohio State graduate. What's happening right here, Linda? And Linda's always like, if nothing, she's always direct, you know, and, you know, she's just like, go right. Oh yeah, that's it. Right. But it's that kind of conversation helps me also realize, you know, just simply, I'm not crazy. Am I making up stuff in my head? No, it's that kind of back and forth. So that piece I did helped me just write out, and it was so therapeutic to really come to another understanding of how I could use that. And you want to know something else that's interesting when we talk about having our research that's transformational. I've had so many leaders, you know, I would say an equivalent to doing that autoethnography piece is a racial autobiography. I've had so many leaders that I've had to, you know, definitely walk them through this, who come back and say, man, this was really enlightening. I mean, it was uncomfortable at first, but in terms of thinking about the work I do every day, all the things that I was just not conscious of or doing, and saying that this is correct, especially when it came to, you know, children, or making some assumptions, not questioning my motivations. Those kinds of things, I believe, really enrich my work, right, out of this qualitative piece. And so obviously I've written a piece with Anna O'Doherty on it, and I'm doing more work on it. But it was that kind of thing that the field really said, this is really speaking to us and how we are changing our practice. And you see my book, 5 Practices for Equity Focused School Leadership. We actually go into a space where people can really go into explore multiple aspects of their identity.
Thank you. I think that you didn't use the language as you were explaining, but I think you really tapped into this idea of cultural taxation and, you know, how tiring it can be in terms of not just navigating one's research, but also navigating the academy. So I'll ask one last question as we go into the larger Q&A. You talked in your presentation about radical openness and possibility. And I wanted to know if you could share, you know, there's a lot of, I guess, language right now around futures and futurity, but what would you say is one future that we might anticipate, whether it's in the academy or a possible future as we think about qualitative research, given some of the things that you've shared today?
Yeah, and I would say, you know, definitely, you know, one of those possibilities is thinking differently about how we support you know, the scholars of color in the academy.
Mm-hmm.
And this would be, I think, radical for some people because folks start to get into what's not equal and, you know, who gets access to what. And I just believe that we don't take account for the how people are situated differently in the academy in terms of scholars of color. Even if they come in and they're required to do just the basic, you know, publish or perish, it's not the basic publish or perish. When I start talking about, you know, I love what Claude Steele talks about, this cognitive load, right? Those additional things that you got to work through every day, the John Henryism, the imposter syndrome, and like my colleague, y'all know Rich Reddick writes about this cultural taxation piece, and I usually try to cite him and Padilla in that idea of these things that add up. I would like to see the institution move away from this racialization and think about how we really support those folks. And we usually say, we're going to support them, we're going to give them a mentor, and we're going to, but like, how do they really need to be supported? Have you asked them? Have you checked in with them? And more often than not, it's like, we want to tell you how we know how to, well, if you tell me how I need to support it, it's from your perspective. You know, I had a doc student say this, I don't know, I'm not big on, I'm on Twitter, but I'm kind of not on Twitter. Mm-hmm. But I had a doc student, and I so appreciated the honesty of his comment, but he said something like, man, as a Black man, you know, these institutions are talking about they're being woke, and they keep bringing in these experts, and they'll probably like me or somebody to come in and talk to say, but I'll tell you what I need. He said, I need somebody to help me relieve some of this debt. I got like thousands of dollars. I'm going to school. And as a Black person, I came from a particular kind of community, and I'm positioned a certain kind of way. Everybody's like, it's so great that you got in. Yeah, you made it. But then I'm saddled with debt. Not to mention, once again, John Powell talks about people being situated differently coming from particular communities. Now, I'm not generalizing saying all Black folks come from economically depressed. I'm not saying that. But we know that there's a larger percentage of our students who have familiar obligations and support for folks they need to take care of family members, but we pretend like we don't. I mean, I remember when I first came to Ohio State, I was on fellowship and I was getting like a big salary of like $930 a month. You know, I was doing it big, right? But because I really just have an obligation and a thought of like supporting my family, $100 of that each month was sent back home to mom. I was just like, I know she's trying to work and take care of I know she needs, and so I just ate a little bit less. I mean, it's amazing what you can live off of when you just start living off it. And I can't believe at the time Ohio State actually taxed it. It was a little bit of tax, but I was like, man, it's not that much. But it was a little tax on that stipend, or a bigger tax was, how can I give back? And so if somebody had really recognized that, or we recognize where students are and what they really need, then we would be developing a newer future. But we got to be bold about that, because we can't get afraid and say, oh, somebody's gonna say that's unfair. And I could go on and on. But I just say, if we want to really build a better future and be serious about recruiting and retaining scholars of color, that's a double-edged sword. We recruit all these great scholars, and then we get them in here, and then we just like go off to the office and publish. No, You spent money and time, faculty hours bringing those people in. You mean to tell me you're not going to make sure they make it? That's an institutional loss. We don't frame it right. We say, oh, you didn't get tenure. You know, your loss. No, that's that person's loss and the institution's loss, right? I would say more so the institution has shown that it's not doing what it's supposed to support folks of color and be serious about the real things that they're dealing with. And what causes that? I can say this conversation about racialization. Oh, we have, you know, traditional cultural norms. We've been using these for 100 years. And they didn't work for us then, and they're definitely still not working for us now.
Mm-hmm. I know Jasmine has thoughts about this exact topic. We talked about it, but I know you've got to share the important questions that our colleagues have offered. So Jasmine, I'll turn it to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I could listen to you all talk all day long, but some of our attendees have some really pressing questions that they love to ask. So we have one here from Ashley. The question is, with the normalization of racism and hegemonic standards for scholarship and the gatekeeping of what gets accepted to publish, how do you suggest remaining true to our positionality and uplifting the importance of our experiences and identities when submitting for publication?
Ooh, beautiful question, Ashley. I would say we're sometimes deceived about some ways that the academy truly works. I would say that you know, young scholars up and coming, like, make sure that you know which journals are going to be friendly to your work. But in addition to that, make sure you know some journal editors. You know, I'm an associate editor with Rich Milner on urban education, and we really do what we can to try to support up and coming scholars and support work that otherwise wouldn't get in, you know, particular venues or wouldn't get considered. And we want to always say to young scholars, you know, definitely do your best to make sure your work is good, but also understand that you want to be in relationship with people and have conversations with folks. And you want some of those people in your circle to be journal editors or people who've been journal editors, and they can share a lot of wisdom in a matter of like 15 minutes or so, things that you didn't even think about, especially if you have this type of work. Now, we're recognizing that kind of a broader more of an openness to that, but it is very tricky. It is very tricky, but definitely know who some of those editors are, and have people who can look at your work before you submit it. That just saves you time. You have a limited amount of time. Those 5 or 6 years, they go by so quickly. So you have to be really smart in how you organize your work and how you organize your community to support you.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that response there. We have another question that I think will be really great as well too, from Tamika Ferguson. With respect to doing research with colleagues who may not share our racial or ethnic identity, how do we account for and or consider the potential impact of shared or oppositional positionality in qualitative research that centers the experiences of marginalized populations?
How do you consider the
how do we account for and or consider the potential impact of shared or oppositional positionality in qual research that centers the experiences of marginalized populations?
And what I interpret this as, you know, if I'm writing an article or doing research with maybe a white colleague, what does that look like? You know, I have a certain positionality, you know, for studying Black people.
Yeah.
My white colleague does not, right? How do you deal with, I don't know, the tension of that when the populations, you know, are people of color?
Right. Thank you, Dr. Patton Davis, for that clarification. So I think this is definitely a difficult thing. I'm at a point now where I can offer a little more support to colleagues, and I do talk to a number of my who certainly I have friends who are white men who are full professors, and we can have some really rich conversations about this. I think you can have those at a particular level, but you have to be mindful of, if that doesn't work, how much time do I want to put into this? I'll just be frank. I'm finding myself oftentimes in a role of trying to, I don't want to say educate colleagues, but to be reflective for them as they think through some things. And I'm okay with that. But in time, that's a little bit of less of a risk for me. I mean, I don't have to publish. I mean, I certainly want to do more writing and research, and I'm committed to that. But that takes time. It takes time to engage with your colleagues. It takes time to engage with colleagues who make errors, and sometimes full professors are called on to talk to other colleagues. So I don't want to get off and make it autobiographical about me. I would just say to that person, work to some extent to see how it goes, and if it feels right and represents who you are, go with it. If it's not working, you know, you can always gently and politely say, you know, this one's not working for me. Because there are a number of great colleagues, I'm sure, who would work well with you. I'm finding a number of white scholars want to be more open to doing this right. The way the climate has been last year, nobody wants to be that person, right? You know, I don't know if there's such thing as an academic Karen, but you know, you don't want to be that person. So more folks are coming to the space and asking questions about that. I'm also finding there's additional pressure on a lot of scholars because I think Dr. Patton Davis referred to this like last time. There are some institutions now who actually have any RFPs, like we want to bring on scholars who are assistant profs or who have particular kinds of lived experiences. And you haven't seen that before, right? So a lot of scholars of color are being pulled on multiple projects. And so we got to be careful about that as well, especially for assistant profs. You just have to be really, really mindful about how your time is spent.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. So in line with that question, we have some folks who are asking specifically, how can I, as a white person, use my white privilege to contribute to the resistance of racialization in the academy? Like specifically, what are some ways we can put our awareness into action?
Ooh, thank you, Jasmine. That's a good one. So what I would say, and what I've said to white colleagues is, I think you definitely have to do your work. You got to do your reading. It's a number of really great Black scholars who, I mean, I just can't get enough of it. You got to be reading some of those folks, and you read within the literature, but read outside. I'm just, you know, but you have to do your work. I mean, so many scholars, I think, I've come, I shouldn't say so many. I've run into a number of white scholars who ask that question, and then we talk about it from a scholarly perspective, right? And then they're like, they haven't really read as much. And I said, well, you got to do that, right? The other thing you got to do is, you know how this works. You should be, if you haven't read enough to cite Black scholars, it doesn't mean they don't exist. It means they're outside your consciousness because you haven't read, right? So you got to do your reading. And then you also have to use what you know about the academy to promote folks in the academy in the ways in which I found, you know, a number of white colleagues do that. I told you I've served in administrative pieces. But there are meetings when we are talking about topics at the full professor level, and more than a few times I've had a couple of colleagues, we've been in kind of these crazy meetings, and I brought up something, and it was almost like I was bringing up something like new, and it was around race and culture. And I had a colleague send me an email later or talk to me outside. That was great that you brought that up, and I just like, that would have been great if you had said it when we were in the circle, right, in the room. And I just say, you know, I understand that there may be some concerns or some anxiety on your part, but understand that I have to live with that, you know. So let's try to do that next time. And there are folks who next time have brought that up, and so, but we have to call that out. I'm at a level where I can do that, but I think that that's something that folks have to do, and also make sure, you know, they're protecting themselves, you know, in that whole process as well.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Gooden. I think that had to have been our last question. Folks did ask though, Penny, will the resources or the PowerPoint slides be shared?
Yes, absolutely. We're going to have the resources on the Quell Lab website, which will be on the last PowerPoint slide, and also make sure that any resources mentioned, Bakari Lumumba, one of the GRAs, is going to put together a list of all the references mentioned, have Dr. Gooden check it out, and then post that as well. Lori?
Whatever is on Quell will be, on Quell Lab will be on the Ed Studies website as well. So here are, if for those of you who are interested in learning more about Dr. Gooden's work, these are just a few of his many publications. Please do check them out. Penny?
Yes, also, we want to thank you, Dr. Gooden, for your time and energy. We've appreciated this so much. We'll be sending you a nice thank you gift from the Office of Advancement, but also wanted to mention to everyone that you'll have a survey that you'll see that we just appreciate incorporating your feedback as we move forward. And our final speaker of the series is Dr. Malik Henfield, who we're excited to host. And again, I mentioned, here's the website, all the videos will be here. So thank you, Dr. Gooden. Thank you to everybody for attending. And we hope that this is an ongoing conversation and you'll continue to really push on some of the things that Dr. Gooden mentioned here in order to really change and interrupt the existing academy as it stands, because we need you. So thank you so much.
Thank you.